Very sorry. In the limited time we have, I'm going to skip some of the most important themes because they've been dealt with greater erudition than I can muster. I'm going to speak on a few contemporary themes, few themes that I believe remain of contemporary relevance. It's not that I'm, uh, you know, brushing aside what was said. I agree with much of what was said. And I do agree with Ashwini that the caste chapter is fascinating. How can it not be the resilience of that system when 3 days ago we were discussing the voting in Panjim constituency of Goa, how it's going to be determined by whether the Catholic Brahmins and the Saraswat Brahmins vote the same way or differently. Okay, that's how this system is. Now, the myths and the tragedies, the realities, the anecdotes of scarcity, hunger, and famine are prolific to many parts of this country, but somehow have a particular edge when it comes to Odisha in the last few decades. It's important because these invariably raise questions of the causes of scarcity, hunger, starvation, drought, and famine. And I don't need to tell this audience how frequently these terms were and are used interchangeably in the media to build huge narratives around natural calamity, and that can even tend to drive public action in particular directions. The amount of baloney published in the 1980s and 1990s in the media around Kalahandi, for example, was a great example in our times. I remember India Today's and Indian Express and Hindustan Times stories, and I'm quoting, of an accursed land with blighted fields where not a blade of grass would grow, a Dantesque inferno of drought. Actually, in 1918-90, when much of this appeared, the per capita output of grain in India averaged 203 kilograms. For Odisha, the figure was 253. And Kalahandi the same year, it was 331 kilograms, raising very, very interesting questions about how you could have that kind of hunger deaths and stuff in such a situation. I like the fact that this book begins in its very first line of the introduction with, what is a famine? And I think there's a very interesting discussion of this that follows. In fact, I think this is a great book. I just think this factor alone makes that book important and a must read and a very useful addition to the literature on the subject. For me personally, Professor Mohanty, I'm struck, as I said, I'm trying to avoid what was covered. I'm struck by the role or factor of Utkala Deepika. I have to say that your book drew me to things I never knew about Utkal Deepika. And I have been looking up on the net for whatever I could find in English about Utkala Deepika. I knew a little bit more about the press of Ganjam with the later day work of Gopabandhu Das and Dainik Asha, and generally with the Berhampur journalists who looked closely at the phenomenon of migration, particularly in their time towards Burma, though it was not the major destination. Even today, till recently, there have been 3 streets or markets in the town of Berhampur called Burma Market or Burma Street. By the way, that's my ancestral town on the maternal side. But Dr. Mohanty's book draws our attention to the fact that there was a lively discussion in Utkal Deepika. We're talking about 1860s, okay, around the issues of hunger and famine. From what I understand, it even looks in some degree at the migrations. I think this is certainly an addition to our knowledge, certainly about the media or the press in the time of famine. It also makes us, as we should, view several of the statistics of the period with caution and skepticism, and I think that's well brought out actually in the book. All that there is on migrants and migrations in the book, by the way, I'm a guy who spends most years 2 months traveling with migrants, very often from Odisha. I like to call that journalism. And all that there is on migrants and migrations in this book raises questions that remain relevant to our times. Berhampur is the biggest labor travel station, perhaps in Eastern India. If you take the Ahmedabad Puri Express, a train that touches Surat 5 times a week, almost its entire revenue comes from out migrants going to Surat. Note that the ticket sales in that direction is several times higher than for the reverse journey. I've explored that route with them and found that there's the survival strategies they've brought up, the way they cope, unique remittance and money transfer systems like the Tapawala. It works with direct delivery at a much lower cost than other systems of money couriering. For people who cannot afford or are intimidated by the regular banking system, in 2009, just migrants from Ganjam to Surat were sending home 500 crores. And a fourth of that through this informal money courier system called Tapawala. In our time, too, globalization of the neoliberal variety devastated these migrants. There are lakhs of Odias working in the mills of Surat, and the 2008 Wall Street crash devastated them. The collapse in demand, cancellation of orders for millions of garments, saw over 50,000 migrants head back to Ganjam alone from Surat. There are about 93 bastis with Odia workers in Ganjam, in Surat. That caused serious social and law and order problems back home. Property disputes, brother killing brother. The NREGS could not cope, though it did. It made a very, very serious and great effort. There's one thing that, Professor Mohanty says that I want to maybe diverge a little from, or it's true what she says, almost the same set of factors are in operation even now in the face of a vibrant democracy and an active press in India. The factors, yes. I would suggest that the actors have changed dramatically in content. That subject is such a provocative and large thing, it probably deserves several books in itself, a vast and incredibly complex thing. Because, the same factors, when we are discussing the active press in India, what were they active about then and what are they active about now? Who owned the press? Who owned the media? Who did they represent? Whose questions and issues were they raising? I think the central gigantic discussion, and I think it's all important and relevant to all discussions of the media and public action and hunger, is the corporatization of the media. Okay, this is just phenomenal, and it's what I call the paradox of the Indian media. In the 1890s, you have a Reuters correspondent, S.H.M. Merriweather, writing a book on his journey to the famine districts of India. He was imported by the British, in his words, to reply to the riffraff of the nationalist press. It's very interesting that in 1893, a tiny press could put an empire on the defensive. Today, so a tiny press represented a much larger social dimension. Give me a minute. Today a gigantic media and entertainment industry is a 2 trillion rupee industry. Represent a spectacularly narrow interest. A much larger media represented the richest man in India is also the biggest owner of the media, and the media he does not own, he is the biggest advertiser. You could see the impact of that in the coverage of the media of the farmers' protests. Who the heck is going to say anything against Ambani? Yeah. Not even once did they tell you that Mr. Ambani's personal wealth equals the GDP, the GSDP of Punjab. And the farmers were taking his name in every slogan. So look at how reverse migrations were covered under the pandemic. The media were totally ill-equipped to cover them. And in fact, what ended up happening at a time when when journalists were needed most, the media sacked 2,500 journalists and between 10 and 15,000 non-journalist media workers. And that is, for me, another story, but well worth pursuing from the points and themes of this book. which I found very valuable, most interesting, and for lack of time, I'm not covering a number of other things on the caste and other issues which I found fascinating. But it's a great book, Professor Mohanty.
Thank you, Professor Sainath. That brings us to the end of the session where the speakers have their preliminary thoughts on the book. I now invite Professor Swarnamay Tripathi to conduct the question-answer session and also to later on invite the panelists and the author to respond with their concluding remarks. Professor Swarnamay Tripathi, over to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ritusha. Warm greetings to all esteemed speakers and participants for being a part of this very insightful book discussion, A Hunting Tragedy by Dr. Bidyut Mohanty. And the brainstorming critiques and multidimensional comments have certainly provoked many thoughts, but I hardly find any questions in the chat box. So you can post your questions or you may raise your hand. But
Meera Chakraborty has raised the hand.
Yes. I request Meera Chakraborty to put up her questions.
Namaskar, Professor Mohanty, and greetings to all. What I would like to contextualize here is that this is a natural famine which has occurred. Okay. But Satyajit Roy's movie, and he is quite a researcher before he does his movie Ashwini Deshpande in 1973 also depicted the famine. And the factors that you mentioned are also almost similar, even in the factors that Roy has depicted. I have been a member of the State Commission Women earlier, and also an academician. And during our visits to the interior part of Karnataka, I'm from Karnataka in Bangalore, I have seen that the pension, the government pension that a woman receives, that is 75 rupees, the block development officer makes a demand. No, this is aside his salary, makes a demand from the woman 25 rupees of 75 rupees. Now, this is such a heinous act that, and we reported it to the Chief Minister because as a statutory body, we were accounted to only Chief Minister. And luckily he was socialist, J.H. Patel, Mr. J.H. Patel, he died, he's no more. And this is, do you think that, I mean, I would like to say that even if without a situation of famine, the complexities that you bring out in gender analysis are still there, even without the famine situation. Do you think we should have a right to recall their representatives? Or do you think that the capitalistic ideology is actually creating such a havoc? Do you think that the democratic socialists, or at least because they speak of equality, will bring, because at 1950s we had a lot of seats in parliament from the democratic socialist group in India, which is now lost. So this is very complex. I mean, I just am so flabbergasted as to where actually to pinpoint, and we have no mechanism to right to recall our representatives. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Miraji. Now we have another participant, Professor Anand Giri. Professor Giri, you can have your questions.
Moro Hrudayara Krutagnata, Professor Bidyut Mohanty. I am sharing this in Odia, which means my heartfelt gratitude is to Professor Bidyut Mohanty. So I'm eagerly looking forward to reading your book, listening to the deliberations, a few queries. Now, in your study, have you also looked into the condition of children? And because children everywhere, as Janusz Korczak, the great story writer whose work you published in, about whom you published in parents and pedagogue, that they are the oldest proletariat of the world. So how do we retrieve their stories? What kind of historical methodology we can have, given that we are trying to understand it almost after 150 years? The related query is, you mentioned you visited the Chaturkhya communities, and that understanding the present as a way of understanding the past, which of course brings us to the very interesting dimensions of history and anthropology. But methodologically, I wish to know, when you speak to the present, how they were able to retrieve that memory, what were the dynamics of memory and memory documents if they could have. So if you could tell us a little about it. Then my query to Professor Pritish Acharya is that you mentioned about Fakir Mohan's, rendering of Ravenshaw, and he, on the one hand, he is a noble person, and the other hand, he was responsible. So I wish to request you to kindly reflect upon it a little more. But in that vein, to understand that history, whether Madhusudan Das and Pandit Gopabandhu had a differential understanding of Gopabandhu, for example, did hold Ravenshaw accountable for this in a way, man-made tragedy. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Professor Giri. Is there any more questions, or should we request? Should we request?
No, Suranjita has a question.
Okay, Suranjita.
Can I?
Suranjita.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, you can go ahead. Yeah.
I can speak. Yeah, thank you. Actually, I haven't read this book, but I need to congratulate to Dr. Bidyut Mohanty, because I have been very familiar with her writings in not just several articles in EPW and other important journals, but also I've read her original PhD thesis, which is on the famine studies and 1866 famine. And I have drawn a lot of insight from her work, because I have also worked on hunger in Kalahandi, and she is been an excellent scholar who's done in-depth research on understanding not just famine as a concept. I would like to just acknowledge here that it is important to delineate famine from a fixed meaning, because the experiences give meaning to the concept. And that's so relevant even today, because we do not measure famine only in terms of mortality. And we've gone through several such research works, and Dr. Bidyut Mohanty has brought that with clarity in her work, where she explains famine as a process. And this process of famishment is very, very important, because he's talking of famine conditions that prevail and persist. And she wants to understand hunger from the vantage point of the starved. I think that's the most important methodology that she's highlighted in her work and focused, by not just looking at the multidimensionality of famine as socioeconomic, political, cultural, and psychological dimensions, but she also tells that it is important to leave this concept to include many more such experiences, maybe in the forthcoming future. So famine, what she conceptualizes, has moved much beyond the conventional conceptualization of understanding it in terms of rigidity and mortality alone, but to bring in processes of vulnerability. And she does address processes of structural deprivation, where caste, class, and gender dimensions as structures of power relations matter. So this is what has been very striking in her work, and has contributed massively to the studies of famine, not just in Orissa, but across countries. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Suranjita. Mr. Mohanty, you can have your question, but please be precise.
Yeah, I'll be very precise. Thank you. Very excellent presentation and discussion on this. My question is directed to Mr. Pritish Acharya on the relationship between Alekh Dharma and the famine. If you could elaborate a little more, that will be more interesting if you can highlight upon the relationship between these two.
Okay, thank you. Now I would invite the speakers to
No, Amarendra Patnaik has to raise a question. Yeah.
Yes, yes, sir.
okay,
Yes, sir.
okay, okay.
Sir, my question is to Mr. Sainath. Now, I would like to raise two issues. One is that, as sir rightly mentioned, that 1% of India's population are cornering more than 50% of the wealth. That is one. Second is that we have defined this BPL category beautifully. That if somebody is earning more than 50 rupees a day, good enough that he is not in BPL category. Now, does these two indicators indicate that we are going through a kind of invisible famine, that everything looks in order, but we are actually in a deep problem? Like in a, let's say, when we discuss the famine of the past, maybe there is devastation. People are not getting food to eat. A lot of people are dying and all that kind of distress. But maybe currently we are not noticing such distress. But perhaps there is a definite undercurrent that a lot of distress is happening, but it has remained invisible. We have become very, very tolerant. And I would like to have the opinion of Mr. Sainath on this point, that on the 1% people cornering more than 50% wealth in India, this Gini coefficient being less than 0.4 in India, more than 0.4, and then this BPL definition, that anybody who is earning more than 50 rupees is not BPL. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Patnaik. Now I would like to invite the panelists to answer the questions. I would request each panelist to take only 2 minutes to answer it.
Madam Tripathi, I think authors should also respond to the query.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
It will be great if the author responds, then the panelists.
Madam, would you like to respond first?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Actually, it seems that Professor Dyson has left, but
Professor Dyson is there.
Yeah. See, the 1/3 population dying, it wasn't my assertion. It was the findings of the Famine Commissioner. Also, economic historians like William Hunter and many other census commissioners have elaborated on that. And I will just submit one thing. After 150 years of that occurrence of that famine, he wasn't there, I wasn't there also. So I don't know. But just one point I would argue, that till 1900, Orissa division was was so depopulated that vast land remained uncultivated and many houses remained unoccupied. And, it did not experience any major famine. If you want to match resources and famine, the famous Malthus hypothesis. This is what my question is. And about Uma's question, answer is implicit already. It is still a patriarchal society. And, if you see the way women get discriminated during COVID situation, so it was more intense during the famine period. They were discriminated against, and, they died in large numbers, though the official statistics do not show that. I don't know whether I did answer your query. So, and coming to Ananta, you asked about the children. Yes, children were the most malnourished and they died in large numbers. The economic historians of that time, William Hunter, for example, they say, children, nobody cared about them. Sometimes, so sorry to tell, sometimes people just ate their own children. They were so starved. So, and then methodology about collecting data on Satrakya, I have already elaborated. Namely, I have visited them, I talked to them, and also the lot of material is available in the district gazetteers and census commission reports of 1901. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. Now may I invite Professor Team, would you like to say something?
Well, I would just reiterate that I think it's a fantastic book, and the fact that Dharma Kumar, in a sense, set you off on this pathway is well, it's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. I'm sure she would be, thrilled by what you produce. Absolutely fantastic. I mean, I won't go back into all the various points and so on. I think, but. It's a terrific book, is what I would say. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tim. Now I would like to invite Professor Acharya to respond to the questions.
The 2 minutes I have got. One is that Mr. Sainath had been mentioning about Utkal Devika and its role after during the famine of 1866. I would like to mention that Samaj had been brought out, Samaj which continues even today and had been the synonym for newspaper in Odia. That it was started in 1919, and one of the stated objectives of Samaj is to discuss about the famine of 1918, that people should know what has been happening. And then also there should be, coordination between the relief workers and the nationalists under the leadership of, Gopabandhu Das had initiated it. And since then, anytime such tragedies happen, the Samaj as an organization start the relief centers in Orissa. Professor Anantagiri has mentioned about the Revensa, not the Revensa, T.E. Revensa. And one of the conditions for funding the Revensa, it was not Revensa College, Kotak College, was to name it after Revensa, T.E. Revensa. And finally, and the funder was the Baripada or the Mayurbhanj Maharaja, and he had given a condition that it should be named after Revensa, otherwise probably he would have objections in giving funds to the college. What I was mentioning, that the entire new middle class, and this he was not an illiterate person, this Revensa is a Mayurbhanj Maharaja, that the entire new middle class, educated middle class, had eulogized Mr. Revensa and had seen him as a very noble-hearted man. Probably Senapati, writing after 50 years of the famine, partially blames Revensa for the T. Revensa for the famine, but the blame is more on the other people, the subordinates and the non-Odia officials, clerks and Amlas. About Mohima Dharma, there was a question that Mohima Dharma, this I did not know, though I am from Orissa and also from Western Orissa, where Mohima Dharma has spread. I know about Mohima Dharma, but say that Professor Mohanty has connected it to the famine and says that as Christian missionaries had attracted people from the low caste and low class, that Mohima Dharma has also, it was a product of this time, 19th century, and we see that it has attracted people from the low caste, low class, and also marginal peasants, Chosa, marginal peasants. But what I was saying, that when the Christian missionaries are founded for, spreading their religion or attracting people to their religion. That so we are yet to prove. So we are yet to see say how this Mohiman Dharma, which is a say anti-caste, anti-idol worship, anti-Brahminic, they had survived and had survived because of the say coming of the lower class and lower caste and also marginal peasants to it. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to respond. I had a few other things, but still I'm very happy that I got time to speak my mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. May I invite Professor George? Would you like to tell something?
Okay, so he might be finding it difficult to
unmute.
Sainath.
Okay, now I invite Professor Sainath ji to address to the questions.
Let me tell my friend that I am not in the business of making predictions of famine. I'm very apprehensive and scared of making any such suggestions. Though, okay, by the way, from soon after independence, the discussion around that term took many new turns. The state of Maharashtra, where I live, was the first state in the country in 1963 to pass an act unanimously passed by the assembly banning the use of the word famine in any official laws and documents. It was called the Maharashtra deletion of the term famine from all laws applicable to the state. 1963, as far as I remember, it was passed unanimously. However, the relevance of your question, I think large-scale hunger, distress migrations and reverse migrations are very much there. Large-scale distress, maybe we want to recognize it in forms we are familiar with, but the distress is extremely high, and it goes very clearly with what you are implying, with unprecedented levels of inequality in our lifetime. Don't just look at the one. Why look at 1%? Look at 0.000014%. $140 billionaires who are Indians. Their total wealth is equivalent, according to Forbes, to 22.7% of your gross domestic product, giving a whole new meaning, that whole other meaning to the word gross. Okay. 140 individuals. By the way, at the beginning of the pandemic, there were 102. In 12 months, we added $38 billionaires. And the point is that COVID-19 actually gave you a spectacular autopsy of the society we are. All the inequalities stood naked on that table, on that autopsy table. This is absolutely unchallengeable if you look at the data, because your $140 billionaires increased their wealth by 94% in the 12 months of the pandemic, when the national economy shrank 7.7%, according to the government of India. Okay. So it's not that there was greater growth and everybody benefited. I'm saying that the kind of distress that now exists is huge. And even more scary is the attitude of large sections of the intelligentsia, the elite, and the ruling classes to that kind of distress. A single point. In August 2020, right, we had 104 million tons of food grain, called surplus, very ridiculous word to use. 104 million tons of food grain in the public distribution system, stockpiled. Now, what did the government do? It announced 5 kilograms per person for 3 months, then extended it 3 months. You had 104 million tons, but the only cabinet pronouncement on this was to clear the conversion of millions of tons of rice. By the way, it is rice, that was rice, that they allowed to be converted. They allowed the conversion of the rice to ethanol to make sanitizer for keeping your hands clean during the. I mean, people were bloody hungry, and you destroyed millions of tons to create ethanol for hand sanitizer for people who don't get to wash their hands twice a day. Okay? I mean, I'm saying that that kind of distress, that kind of inequality, you'd have to go back, as the World Inequality Report says, to 1921 to look at that kind of inequality that exists today. So yes, and you've had from the Maharashtra a minister of food for whom APL, BPL, and IPL were all equivalent categories. I mean, those were his interests. So I think that it's also the mindset that inequality has created, in the upper echelons of society, that is scary as hell, regardless of the definition of BPL.
Thank you, Sainath ji. Over to Rityusha for the chair's remarks.
Thank you, Professor Tripathi. And may I request Professor Deshpande to give her concluding remarks as the chair, as she has to leave. And after that, we can move to Professor Sanjay Sarmah, because he's still left. Yeah, Professor Deshpande.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I have another meeting at 8:30 and I just need a 5-minute break before that. So, as we saw from the discussion, it's a tribute to the wide-ranging scope of the book that brought forward so many comments and questions, and kindled such an interest in the book. So many people who are here today are now going to read the book for sure. And I think the questions related to estimation of, I work with data. So for me, it's always an interest to see how a particular number is arrived at. And I think Professor Dyson's remarks, I'm not an expert in colonial data at all, so I'm not claiming to be, offer any definitive answers. But I think it's very important to carefully be able to analyze the data to tell us what it's saying. So is it migration? Is it deaths? Is it excess deaths due to famine? These are many of the questions that actually have very contemporary resonance. As because of COVID, given that the government is not releasing any data, according to them, nobody died of COVID and nobody died of shortage of oxygen. So, independent scholars and journalists have had to scrape together data to figure out, the excess mortality and the acute economic distress and that COVID has brought forward. All this could be helped if indeed we had figures in real time coming out, as some of the other countries are able to produce. And I think that it's a historical look. It's looking at the 19th century, but it's got so much contemporary relevance, whether it's caste, whether it's gender, and most of all on the question of data and the need for very careful analysis of numbers. So having said that, thank you very much for inviting me to chair this very important session. I wish I could have stayed longer, but I really need to join my other link very soon. So congratulations, Professor Mohanty, again, and lovely seeing everybody here. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Deshpande. Lovely to have you here. May we invite Professor Sanjay Kumar Sarmah for his final thoughts?
Thank you. I'll be brief. Just a couple of points. Many have been mentioned. The suggestion in the 19th century that we must, that British colonial state actually opened relief works, was also prompted by the fact that there was aimless wandering. This aimless wandering bothers administrators even now, as we saw recently. So some of the relief response, I think, has to do with this whole idea that, these aimless wanderers, these paupers, these wretched of the earth, they could take to violence. They could sort of disturb law and order. In that sense, it's a fairly, it's a kind of a chilling kind of an attitude towards the poor. And I think in some ways that persists even now. That's what struck me. And the other point, which is also just building on Sainathji's point about a post-independence state, actually in some parts saying that banishing the term, or prohibiting the use of the term famine. In a larger sense, I think that has been the process all over the world, which is that famines no longer occur. That's because what is a famine means different things to different people. Very often it's the state which defines what a famine is. And states are very reluctant to define because, modern states, famines are bad news. And then there is some obligation on the part of the state to provide relief, which very often they try and postpone or they restrict. So while it is clear to a very large number of people that they are experiencing hunger, insufficiency of food intake, etc., etc., for political administrators and the state, if it is above a certain level, sometimes arbitrarily defined, it's not a famine. So in the modern world, we can no longer have famines. So I think we have to go beyond that. And I think this book suggests that as well. And to look at issues of structured poverty, malnutrition, access by all kinds of marginal groups to food. And I think those are the issues, and therefore looking for official definitions will actually mislead us. And therefore, in that sense, learning from the past, but also seeing how we've gone beyond some of these older categories, and yet the problems persist in older and newer ways. I think I'll stop here. There are several things which one can say, but it's been a pleasure listening to everyone else. And once again, Professor Bidyut Mohanty, many thanks for this book, and I think everyone should read it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sarmah. Now may I invite Professor Akhil Ranjan Datta to deliver the vote of thanks. And
Dr. Matthew joined.
Dr. George Matthew has joined if he wants to.
Yeah.
Few words. So unmute yourself. Yeah.
No, I have no words to thank Bidyut. I always call her Bidyut, and then Orissa Bidyut means electricity. She has that power and that energy which I could observe in the last nearly 40 years. And in fact, this issue of famine and related issues you have brought to the center stage for discussion, thinking, and action. And as my friend Sainath has mentioned, we are having a man-made famine and natural famine. And now I feel man-made famine is much more worse than the natural famine. So with all our technology, with all our other facilities, why can't we counter, we can counter very much the natural calamity, but how can we counter the man-made famine? And that is an issue researchers in the universities, students, those who are working for PhD and other things, they have to take this issue as a very important concern. And I hope there will be a change in our thinking, and I look forward to a positive reaction in the coming years. Thank you very much, Bidyut, and all the panelists. And it was a wonderful evening, intellectually, and a stimulating thinking process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Matthew. Professor Datta, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ritucha. So, the publisher, Manohar publisher, Rameshji was supposed to give the vote of thanks. Probably he couldn't join. Therefore, on his behalf and on behalf of all the organizers, I take the privilege to thank everyone, express our gratitude for this wonderful evening, a discussion, very insightful discussion on the book, around the book. And it has really been very illuminating. Professor Manoranjan Mohanty, the book has been gifted to Professor Manoranjan Mohanty. He is listening to the conversations, but he couldn't be an active participant today on health region. So would you like to say a word, Professor Manoranjan Mohanty?
No, please. Thank you very much.
Okay, sir. At least we have heard your voice. Thank you very much. So this has been a great evening for all of us, a learning experience on and around the book. Therefore, I thank the author at the very outset. I congratulate the author for the book that she has gifted to all of us, and also, provoking us to look at the quote-unquote modern famine kind of things which is happening on and around the pandemic. And also all the speakers in the panel, for their very insightful discussion. We have greatly been benefited by them. We are really, really grateful to you. We are also grateful to the chair, Professor Ashwini Deshpande, for her remarks on the book, also for conducting the event. And I also take the privilege to express our gratitude to these 6 organizations or six associations, organizations, centers we are involved in the process. India International Center, Social Science Research Community, Institute of Social Sciences, Development Research Institute, Bandung Network India, and Manohar Publishers for organizing this event. We are really, really grateful to all who are present here, who raised questions, who listened to the discussions and made the event a success. I also thank Ritucha and also Professor Sarnoy Tripathi for your cooperation towards the successful conduct of this online session. We look forward to having more and more discussion of this kind. And with this, we come to an end of this program. Wish you good night and good health. Thank you very much.